Today, our topic of discussion is the functional and structural organization of the cell membrane. Cell membrane is basically composed of two things. One is a lipid, second is a protein mainly. So, protein constitute more than 50% of the cell membrane, and there are the two types of the proteins. One is called integral proteins and others are called peripheral proteins. So other thing is the lipid cell membrane is composed of the lipid bilayer. Lipid bilayer consists of the one phospholipid has a one head which is a hydrophilic water loving head, and the two fatty acid tails which are hydrophobic, mean the water repelling. So those substances which are lipid soluble can easily cross the cell membrane like O2, CO2 and fatty acids. These substances are the lipid soluble. So cell membrane does not act as a barrier for these substances. Otherwise, like sodium, potassium, and other charged molecule are the heavy size molecule, does not cross the cell membrane through. So how can these substance transport through the cell membrane? So to overcome these problems, nature made a special type of the proteins in which embedded in these lipid bilayer embedded in the lipid bilayer structure of the cell membrane. These are called integral protein. They may act as a carrier protein which transport the substance which are not lipid soluble or heavy molecular weight. So, for example, the movement of the substance through from the higher concentration to low concentration is called simple diffusion. So O2, CO2, fatty acid can move through the cell membrane through simple diffusion. So for example, let's take the example of the simple diffusion of the O2 and CO2. Suppose this is a cell, this is an extracellular fluid, ECF, this is a intracellular fluid. So O2 is high in extracellular fluid and low in intracellular fluid. So there is a concentration difference, concentration gradient. So substance move from the higher concentration to low concentration. Though this O2 can move through simple diffusion without helping of these integral proteins. Simple diffusion move from outside to inside. Let's took the another example of this transport of CO2 through the simple diffusion. CO2 is more concentrated in intracellular fluid and less in extracellular fluid. So there is concentration difference. So CO2 can transport from inside to outside the cell. So these are the few example which can I explain in the simple diffusion. Rate of diffusion depend upon these following factors. First is a concentration gradient. If more concentration gradient across the cell membrane, then more the diffusion takes place. Surface area of the cell membrane. If more surface area variable, then more diffusion take place. Lipid solubility of the substance. Lipid soluble substance like O2, CO2 easily transpose across the cell membrane. So first three things are directly proportional directly proportional and last two things are inversely proportional to the rate of the diffusion. If thickness of the membrane is more thin, the substance is difficult to pass through that membrane. If the molecular weight of the substance like glucose cannot pass through cell membrane easily, so glucose can transport through facilitated diffusion with the help of carrier proteins. So these five factors, mainly five factors, which determine the rate of the diffusion. Diffu Diffusion can be classified into two types: simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. So simple diffusion takes place through these lipid bilayer, not involving the integral proteins, and facilitated diffusion involving these integral protein which act as a carrier protein which transport the substance. So example of the facilitated diffusion is transport of glucose molecule across skeletal muscle and adipose tissue.